I still remember the exact moment my world changed. It wasn't just a little bump in the road. It was more like a seismic shift that cracked everything wide open. My whole life I had thought I knew who I was, who my parents were, and what my family was all about. But then, out of nowhere, the truth hit me like a ton of bricks. I was the result of an affair. Now, don't get me wrong, I had no idea this was coming. There were no obvious signs, no glaring clues that pointed in this direction. But one day, everything I thought I knew came crashing down. The revelation didn't just shake me, it shattered everything. Suddenly, I wasn't sure who I was, where I came from, or what my place in this world was. I mean, imagine waking up one day and realizing that the family you've always known, the relationships you've cherished, have been built on a foundation of lies, secrets, and betrayal. It's enough to make you question everything. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. It was a whirlwind of emotional shock. I couldn't wrap my head around it. The betrayal wasn't just about the affair itself. It was about the family secrets, the emotional turmoil, the deception that had been lurking under the surface all this time. How could they keep this from me? How could they let me live this lie for so long? But here's the kicker. As overwhelming as it was, there was no way I was going to let this define me. I had to make sense of it somehow. I had to figure out how to move forward, how to understand the pain of this family betrayal while also coming to terms with the reality of who I was. And trust me, it wasn't easy. But in a weird way, it was also the start of a personal discovery, a journey that would force me to face some uncomfortable truths, confront my identity crisis, and eventually find the strength to rebuild. I've heard people say that secrets like this can tear families apart. And I get it now. It's not just about the affair itself. It's about the emotional weight that comes with discovering such a deep betrayal. It's about the broken trust, the trust issues that linger long after the truth comes out. And trust me, I've had my share of trust issues ever since. But even in the pain, there's something strangely liberating about confronting the truth. It's painful as hell, but it's also necessary. So, where do you even begin when your world is turned upside down like this? How do you pick up the pieces when everything you thought you knew is suddenly in question? Well, the journey ahead isn't going to be easy. It's going to take time, it's going to take patience, and it's going to take a whole lot of self-compassion. But one thing I know for sure is that understanding the truth, no matter how painful, is the first step toward healing. I'll get into the nitty-gritty of it all. The emotions, the family conflict, the deep betrayal. But right now, I want you to understand that this is only the beginning. What comes next isn't just about dealing with the affair. It's about piecing together the broken parts of yourself, navigating the complicated family dynamics that come with these kinds of revelations, and figuring out how to move forward with a clearer sense of self-identity. So buckle up because it's a wild ride. Next, I'll be diving into what it was like before I knew the truth, the secret I was unknowingly living with. Before I knew the truth, my life felt normal, like any other kid growing up. I had the same family dinners, the same trips to the beach, and the same weekend barbecues that most people have. On the surface, everything seemed perfectly fine, perfectly predictable. But looking back, I can see the cracks now. Those little moments that didn't quite fit, the things that didn't make sense. It's funny, isn't it? How you can live your whole life feeling like you have it all figured out, only to realize that the foundation you've built everything on was never really solid to begin with. I remember growing up, there were always moments when I felt like something was off, but I never really understood what. It wasn't something obvious or even something you could pinpoint, but there were times when I caught a weird look between my parents or noticed they'd get quiet whenever certain topics came up. At the time, I chalked it up to normal family stuff, misunderstandings, little arguments that every family goes through. But looking back now, those were the cracks, the signs of a hidden past, a secret relationship that was hiding in plain sight. As a kid, you trust your parents. It's just what you do. They're the ones who tell you how the world works. They're the ones who protect you, who guide you. So, when you grow up with this unwavering trust in them, it's hard to imagine that anything could ever shake that. But there was this subtle undercurrent of tension that I couldn't quite put into words back then. Like, there were things I knew I didn't know, but I didn't have the maturity or the perspective to even question it. And as I got older, I just accepted it. I didn't push. I didn't ask too many questions. The funny thing is, trust isn't just a word, it's a feeling. And when you grow up trusting your family, You don't always realize how deep that trust goes until it's shattered. There's a comfort in it, right? You just assume that the people you love the most would never lie to you. But somewhere along the way, the facade starts to crack. And that's what happened with me. I couldn't see it then, but I was living in the shadow of this affair, this paternity discovery, that I would eventually learn about. But at the time I just felt like something wasn't right. I wasn't being told everything. And then there's the complexity of your relationship with your parents. I had this picture of them in my mind, these people I looked up to, people I thought I could rely on without question. But now I can't help but wonder, how many other things were they hiding from me? How much of my life, my childhood, my upbringing, was based on family secrets that I never had a clue about? It's hard not to feel betrayed when you realize that your entire sense of security was built on a lie. It's not just about the affair. It's about the emotional turmoil that comes from realizing you weren't given the full picture, that your parents weren't fully honest with you, even about the most fundamental parts of your identity. I guess the scariest thing about living with these secrets is that you don't even know you're in the dark. You think you're just living your life, going through the motions, but beneath it all, there's this deep sense of deception. And once you discover the truth, it's like the world shifts under your feet. The realization that you've been living in this bubble, in a life that wasn't as perfect as you thought, is like a slap to the face. It's a painful revelation that makes you question everything you've known. You start wondering how much of your self-identity was shaped by lies, and how much of your trust in others was misplaced. But here's the thing, it doesn't just change the way you view your family, it changes the way you see yourself. If I was the result of an affair, if my whole existence was the product of deception, what did that say about me? How did that affect my sense of self? How do you rebuild your identity when you realize it was based on something so secretive? I didn't know it at the time, but these were the questions that would soon consume me. Questions that would lead to a whole new chapter in my life. And trust me, when you start uncovering family secrets, the process of personal discovery is no longer optional. It becomes necessary. So, in the back of my mind, I already knew something wasn't right. But I had no idea how deeply the truth would hurt when it finally came to light. It was like a love triangle I never knew existed. My parents, their hidden past, and me. But little did I know that moment of realization was right around the corner. Next, I'll walk you through exactly how I found out the truth. And trust me, the moment it all unraveled is something I'll never forget. The moment I discovered the truth, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. It wasn't something that came in a neat little package, you know? There was no warning, no gentle lead-up. It was like one of those moments in life where everything shifts in an instant, and nothing is ever the same again. It all started with a conversation that, at the time, seemed so trivial. My mom and I were sitting in the living room, and she was flipping through old family albums. Those typical things that every family has hidden in the back of a drawer somewhere, full of awkward teenage photos and vacation memories. But this time, as she pulled out one particular picture, I noticed something strange. A photograph from a family reunion, with a man I'd never seen before, standing awkwardly at the corner of the shot. His face seemed vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it. I had to ask, "Who's that?" It's funny how a simple question can change everything. Her reaction was almost imperceptible, but I caught it. It was that flicker in her eyes, the way her lips pressed together just a little too tightly, that moment of hesitation. I didn't think much of it, but my gut told me something was off. It was like I could feel the weight of something she was holding back, and it made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain. Later that day, I found myself digging through some old boxes in the attic, looking for something entirely different, when I stumbled across a set of letters. Letters my mom had written to someone. Someone I didn't know. They were old, faded, and each one carried the kind of emotion you can only express in writing when you're hiding something. My heart pounded as I sifted through them. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The letters were full of intimate thoughts, secret exchanges, and a level of affection I had never seen from my mom. The person she was writing to wasn't my dad. That much was clear. In that moment, the truth hit me like a freight train. I wasn't the product of just a typical family. I wasn't the child of two people who had built their lives together. I was the result of an affair. The emotional shock that came with that realization was overwhelming. It wasn't just about the affair itself. It was about everything it represented. The lies, the broken trust, the emotional betrayal of it all. And, even worse, the fact that my entire existence had been a result of something hidden from me for my entire life. I can still remember my hands shaking as I put the letters back where I found them, too afraid to confront my mom right away. What would I even say? "Hey, I found your secret love letters. Care to explain?" But it wasn't just the affair that had me rattled. It was the hidden past, the layers of deception that had been cleverly kept from me. And in that moment, it was clear to me that everything I knew about my family had been built on a foundation of lies. The trust one had in them, the family dynamics I had always believed in, shattered. But it wasn't just a matter of confronting my mom either. My dad, who had always seemed like the pillar of strength, the guy I could count on, had to be involved too. And that was the hardest part. How could I look at him and not wonder how much he knew? How could I look at the man who had raised me and reconcile the love I had for him with the painful truth of his own role in this mess? My mind was spinning and I couldn't escape it. The feeling of betrayal consumed me. I was caught in a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, confusion, sadness. I felt like I was standing in the middle of a relationship turmoil I had never asked to be a part of. This wasn't just my mom's affair. This was about me, my identity, and my place in the world. How could I trust anyone again when everything I had known was built on a lie? It was in those moments of intense emotional turmoil that I started to see things differently. I began to question everything. Who was I really? Was I just a byproduct of a broken marriage? A family secret hidden from me for years? How would I move forward now that I knew the truth? These weren't just questions about my parents. They were questions about me. My past, my future, and the very essence of who I was. And that, my friends, is the kind of emotional shock that changes you forever. It's not just the betrayal itself, but the layers of deception that unfold as you dig deeper. The truth doesn't just affect your relationships. It affects your self-identity. You begin to wonder if you even know who you are anymore. But what happened next? Well, let's just say that coming to terms with the truth was going to be a lot more complicated than I ever imagined. And it would force me to confront not just my family, but my entire understanding of myself. But that's a story for the next chapter. Next, I'll dive into how I confronted my family and what their reactions were when they found out I knew the truth. The moment I decided to confront my family was the hardest decision I've ever made. After discovering the truth about the affair, the letters, the hidden past, and the shattered illusion of my family's picture-perfect image, I couldn't just sit on the information anymore. I needed answers. But knowing how to confront the people I loved, especially when I didn't know where to begin, felt impossible. I felt like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss. On one hand, I had this overwhelming urge to scream, to force the truth out of them. On the other, I was terrified of what it would mean for my relationship with them. Could I even go back to how things were? Would the truth destroy everything? I didn't have much time to prepare. It was one of those moments where everything seems to move in slow motion, but you know it's coming whether you're ready or not. I decided to start with my mom. I needed to know why she'd kept this from me for so long. And let me tell you, when I finally sat down with her, I was shaking. I wasn't sure if it was the anger, the hurt, or just the sheer emotional shock of it all, but I was physically trembling. My voice was barely above a whisper as I asked her, "Why didn't you tell me?" The words sounded so simple, but they carried so much weight, so much pain. They were loaded with years of questions, with a lifetime of unanswered fears. She didn't react immediately. Instead, she looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. And there was this silence, so heavy, so thick, that it felt like it was suffocating us both. In that moment, I didn't know if I was supposed to comfort her or if she was going to comfort me. But she didn't. Her eyes welled up, and she looked away, visibly struggling to find the words to explain herself. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the regret, and it stung more than I cared to admit. But there was something else too, something that I hadn't prepared for. Fear. She was scared. Scared of what this truth would mean for her, for us. For the first time, I saw my mother as someone who wasn't just my protector, but also a person who had made a mistake so big that it felt like it could tear our whole world apart. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was small, almost apologetic, and she started talking about the affair, about the other man involved. She told me how it had started, how it wasn't something she had planned or expected, but how, over time, things had gotten out of hand. The affair wasn't just physical. It was emotional. She had gotten caught up in a relationship that was never meant to last, a relationship she couldn't walk away from at the time. And, of course, there was me, her child, a child that came from that secret relationship. She told me that she loved me, that she had always loved me, and that despite how it all began, I was still her daughter, the child she had raised. But as she spoke, I couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal that was deeper than I ever could have imagined. Here I was, the product of this hidden life, this secret relationship, this family betrayal. I kept asking myself, how could she have kept something so monumental from me? How could she have kept the truth about my very identity hidden for so long? The deception wasn't just about the affair. It was about everything. It was about the family secrets, the lies, and the emotional turmoil that had been festering under the surface. Her words weren't enough to heal the wound, though. In fact, they made it worse. The more she spoke, the more I realized how deep the deception ran. The affair wasn't just a one-off mistake. It was the beginning of a whole new layer of complexity in our family dynamics. I didn't know who to trust anymore. How could I look at my mom the same way after hearing about the affair, knowing she had hidden something so crucial from me for years? How could I even look at my dad, knowing that he had been living in this lie, probably unaware of the full extent of the affair, but still living in the shadow of its consequences? When I finally talked to my dad, it was even harder. He had no idea that I knew the truth. And when I confronted him, I saw the confusion in his eyes. At first, he thought I was just accusing him of something random, maybe a minor misstep or misunderstanding. But when I mentioned the affair, the look on his face changed. He went pale, and then he just broke down. He admitted that he had known something was off, that he'd suspected things weren't as perfect as they seemed, but he never knew the full story. He never knew about the other man or the depth of my mom's emotional connection with him. To him, I was still his child, but the weight of the truth hit him like a ton of bricks. And in that moment, it wasn't just about me anymore, it was about him too. He felt the same pain, the same betrayal that I was feeling, but in a different way. The emotional shock I felt in those moments of confrontation was unbearable. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about the family conflict that had been brewing for years. It was about how these two people I trusted more than anyone in the world had been living in this lie, this hidden past, and I had been the one left in the dark. The complexity of it all hit me at once. I wasn't just facing an affair. I was facing the collapse of everything I thought I knew about my family. The truth, while necessary, was also painfully destructive. It was a love triangle I never asked to be part of. A story of deception that was so much bigger than I could have imagined. The emotions I went through in those hours, those days, were beyond anything I could have prepared for. Trust issues, family secrets, personal discovery, they all collided. And I felt like I was being pulled apart by it all. But somehow, in the midst of the chaos, I knew something had to change. I couldn't go back to how things were. The emotional turmoil was too much. The hurtful truth had been laid out, and I was left to pick up the pieces. So what came next? Well, the confrontation was just the beginning. There was so much more to understand, to unpack, to process. But that's a story for the next chapter. How I started to unravel the depth of the affair, and how it changed my entire perception of my parents and myself. Next, I'll explore how I tried to understand the full extent of the affair and the impact it had on my family's relationships. When I first uncovered the truth about the affair, it was like the door to a hidden room in my family's past had been unlocked. But even with the door wide open, I had no idea how deep the rabbit hole actually went. Sure, I had heard snippets of the story, the vague admissions, the half-baked explanations, but nothing prepared me for the full depth of what had really been going on. It wasn't just about the affair itself. It was about how that affair had shaped everything I thought I knew about my family, my parents, and myself. It all started to make sense once I began digging into the details. I learned that the affair had started when my parents were going through a rough patch in their marriage. I had always assumed their relationship was solid, stable if not always perfect, but the truth was that there had been years of underlying tension that I had never been made aware of. My dad, the man I had always looked up to, wasn't the perfect partner I thought he was. He was distant, sometimes emotionally unavailable. And my mom. She was feeling alone, neglected, and ultimately, vulnerable to the attention of someone who made her feel seen, heard, and loved in ways that my dad hadn't. First, I tried to understand. I really did. People make mistakes. Relationships have ups and downs. But what I didn't know, what I couldn't even begin to understand at the time, was how deep the emotional connection had grown between my mom and the other man. It wasn't just a physical affair, it was an emotional affair too. And that's where things became even more complicated. The more I learned about the affair, the more I realized it wasn't a brief fling. It was something that lasted for years, something that my mom had carried with her for so long, hiding it behind the facade of a perfect family. In some ways, the affair was almost like a secret relationship that existed in plain sight. People around us had to have noticed something, right? There had to be signs, clues that others picked up on, but no one ever said anything. No one ever acknowledged the elephant in the room. And that's where the real betrayal lies. It wasn't just about the affair itself, it was about how my entire family had been complicit in this hidden past, this web of lies, and how they had all kept me in the dark. I think the most crushing part of understanding the affair was realizing how much it affected my parents' relationship long after the affair was over. My mom might have ended things with the other man, but the emotional fallout lingered. My dad, even though he didn't know the full extent of the affair, started to feel the strain. There were subtle changes in him. His trust in my mom started to erode, even before he knew the full truth. And while they tried to keep things together for our sake, it was clear to me now that their marriage had never really been the same. The emotional damage from the affair was like a crack in the foundation of their relationship, something that could never fully heal, no matter how much they tried to pretend otherwise. For me, this was the hardest part to swallow. The realization that my parents, the people who had raised me, weren't perfect. I had always put them on pedestals, believing that no matter what, they were the constants in my life. But the truth about the affair shattered that illusion. I started seeing them through a different lens, one where they weren't just my parents but two flawed human beings who had made choices that had hurt not only each other but me as well. It wasn't just the affair, it was the years of emotional turmoil that had followed. The lies, the deceit, the broken trust. Everything had been tainted by this hidden truth that I had never been allowed to see. The affair wasn't just about my mom and the other man. It was about the ripple effect it had on everyone involved. The emotional shock of it all. It wasn't just something that happened in the past. It was something that continued to affect us in ways I didn't understand until much later. My mom's emotional attachment to the other man, her secret guilt, her internal conflict. It was like a weight she carried with her every day. And my dad, even without knowing the full truth, was affected in ways I couldn't fully comprehend at the time. He had his own set of emotional scars to deal with. He didn't know how to heal, how to reconcile his love for my mom with the damage the affair had caused. There was so much pain, so much confusion, that I honestly don't know how either of them survived it. But then there was me. I was the byproduct of it all. I wasn't just the result of an affair. I was the result of years of unresolved tension, hidden emotional wounds, and the quiet breakdown of a marriage. I didn't know it, but I had been living with the consequences of their choices all along. And that hit me harder than anything else. The realization that my very existence was rooted in a hidden, complicated family dynamic that I had never been made aware of was more than I could bear. As much as I hated to admit it, the affair had affected my view of relationships too. I couldn't help but wonder, was my view of love and trust forever distorted? Could I ever trust anyone the way I had trusted my parents? I was suddenly hyper-aware of the emotional turmoil I carried, the trust issues I was left with. How could I move forward when my understanding of relationships had been so dramatically altered? The more I uncovered about the affair, the more I realized how deeply it had woven itself into the fabric of my life, my family's life. It wasn't just a chapter in the past. It was the key to understanding the emotional landscape of our present. The depth of the affair was more than just a betrayal. It was the catalyst for everything that came after. And in that moment, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't going to be something I could just move past. The emotional weight of this hidden past would shape my future in ways I couldn't predict. But even with all of this understanding, I was left with more questions than answers. How do you make sense of something that was never supposed to be part of your story? How do you rebuild trust when the very foundation of your life has been cracked open by the truth? The answers weren't easy, and they weren't quick. But this was only the beginning of the emotional journey I would have to undertake. And as hard as it was, I knew that confronting this past, no matter how painful, was the first step in understanding who I was and who I was becoming. In the next chapter, I'll take a deeper dive into how this affair impacted my ability to trust, how it shook me to my core, and how I tried to rebuild what was broken, starting with myself. But first, I had to confront the pain head-on. Next, I'll share how the betrayal and the affair reshaped my ability to trust, and the personal struggle that followed. When the truth about the affair came to light, everything changed. It wasn't just my relationship with my parents that was affected. It was my ability to trust people in general. Trust, once broken, doesn't just mend itself. It's not something you can fix with a few kind words or a promise that things will get better. No, trust is like a fragile thread, and when it's snapped, it takes time, effort, and a whole lot of healing to weave it back together. And let me tell you, when I found out about the affair, trust wasn't just something I struggled with. It was something I lost completely. I remember feeling betrayed by my parents, yes, but also by myself. How had I not seen it coming? How had I been so blind to the signs? The thing is, betrayal doesn't just happen when someone else breaks your trust. It happens when you realize you've been lying to yourself too. I had built my entire understanding of my family on the belief that they were my safe haven, my rock. They were the ones who would never let me down. But the moment I uncovered the truth, I realized how much I had been ignoring, how much I had chosen to believe in something that wasn't real. I had been living in denial, convincing myself that everything was okay, when in reality there were cracks everywhere. And the emotional weight of it all, it was unbearable. I couldn't look at my mom without seeing the affair. I couldn't look at my dad without wondering if he knew more than he let on. Every time they spoke, every word they said felt tainted. It was like everything was drenched in this fog of betrayal. I didn't know who to trust anymore. Not even myself. How could I trust my own judgment when I had been so wrong about the people I loved most? The hardest part was realizing that the affair had shattered not just my perception of my parents but also my perception of relationships as a whole. What does trust even mean when the people closest to you, the ones you trust the most, have lied to you for years? How do you move forward in a world where you feel like you can't trust anyone? That was the emotional turmoil I was left with. I was stuck in this limbo, unsure of how to rebuild what had been broken. And that's where the real struggle began. It wasn't just about my parents anymore, it was about me. How do I trust again? How do I look at the people around me and not feel this deep, gnawing suspicion in the pit of my stomach? It wasn't just about the affair, it was about the layers of deception that had been built around me, and how those layers had shaped my understanding of love, loyalty, and trust. As I navigated the emotional fallout of the affair, I found myself pushing people away. I didn't want to get close to anyone because I was terrified of being hurt again. I started questioning everything, even the relationships I had with my closest friends. Were they hiding things from me too? Could they betray me in the same way my parents had? Every time someone got too close, I felt this instinctive need to pull back. I didn't want to be vulnerable, not anymore. I didn't want to risk it. But I also knew that if I kept going down that road, I'd be alone forever. I couldn't keep shutting people out. I needed to learn how to trust again, not just others but myself. Because in the end, it wasn't just about repairing my relationships with my family. It was about learning to trust myself to make better decisions, to see the truth even when I didn't want to. That was the hardest part, facing the fact that the betrayal wasn't just about what they did. It was about what I had allowed to happen. And the only way to heal was to confront that head-on. The pain of betrayal didn't just fade away. It lingered day after day. I had nightmares thinking about the affair, about the lies. I couldn't escape it. But in time, I realized that healing wasn't going to come from avoiding the truth. It was going to come from embracing it. I needed to sit with the pain, let it wash over me, and then start to rebuild. Trust wasn't going to return overnight, but I could start small. I could work on trusting myself again, making choices that were true to who I was, not who I thought I was supposed to be. It's funny in a way. We spend so much of our lives trying to avoid pain, trying to protect ourselves from hurt, but sometimes the only way to heal is to go through the pain, to let it take its course. And I had to do that. I had to face the hurt, the betrayal, and the anger, and let it teach me something. Because, in the end, the only way to rebuild trust is to understand where it went wrong in the first place. And that's what I did. I took it one step at a time. I allowed myself to feel everything, the hurt, the anger, the confusion. And then slowly, bit by bit, I started to rebuild. It wasn't easy and it wasn't fast, but eventually I learned to trust again. Not just in others, but in myself. And that, I realized, was the key to healing. But healing doesn't happen all at once. It's a process, and that process takes time. As I continued down this path of self-discovery, I found myself facing new challenges. New questions. How would I move forward from the emotional scars that the affair had left? How would I deal with the long-term effects of that betrayal? Well, that's a story for the next chapter. Because the pain didn't end there. The emotional aftermath of the affair was far from over. But one thing was for sure. I had started to take control of my own healing. And that was a huge step forward. Next, I'll explore how I began to grieve the idealized family I had once known and how I started to let go of that perfect image. When I first learned about the affair, it wasn't just my relationship with my parents that changed. It was everything. It was the way I viewed the world, the way I saw relationships, and most importantly, the way I saw my family. I had always believed that my family was the perfect one. I mean, doesn't everyone think that, at least in the beginning? You're taught that no matter what, family is supposed to be the one constant in your life, the foundation you can always rely on. But that illusion was shattered the moment I discovered the affair. Let me tell you, there's a unique kind of grief that comes with realizing that your family isn't the perfect image you've held in your mind. It's not just disappointment, it's a deep, gut-wrenching loss. I had spent my whole life looking up to my parents, believing that they had it all together, that they had a love that could withstand anything. The truth was, their relationship had been falling apart for years, and I had been living in a bubble, unaware. That bubble burst, and the pieces of that idealized family I had in my mind scattered everywhere. It's funny how, when you're a kid, you don't question the love your parents have for each other. You don't see the cracks, the quiet tensions, the unsaid things. You just see them as the perfect pair, the mom and dad who are supposed to be your everything. But when you grow up, when you uncover the truth, it's like someone pulls back the curtain and suddenly you see the real picture. And trust me, it's not as pretty as the one you imagined. The more I learned about the affair, the more I realized how much my parents' marriage had been built on secrets and lies. My mom's emotional attachment to the other man, my dad's obliviousness to the cracks in their relationship. It was all one big, painful revelation. Grieving that perfect image of my family wasn't just about the affair. It was about everything it represented. It was about the years I spent believing that love was supposed to look a certain way, that my parents had some kind of magical bond that could never be broken. But that was all just a facade. And when the truth came out, I felt like I had lost the family I thought I knew. And it wasn't just my parents who were affected, it was me too. I was caught in the middle of this emotional storm, trying to figure out who I was in the aftermath of it all. If my family wasn't what I thought it was, then who was I? What was my place in all of this? Was I just a byproduct of their mistakes? I spent so much time mourning the loss of that perfect family image that I almost forgot to grieve for myself. I didn't just lose the idealized family I had in my mind. I lost a part of myself too. I lost the version of me that I thought was built on something solid, something real. Letting go of that image was harder than I ever expected. It wasn't just about accepting the truth, it was about accepting that my parents, my family, were flawed just like everyone else. That's a tough pill to swallow. You grow up thinking that your family is invincible, that they're your safe haven in the world. But when that foundation cracks, when you realize that the people you trusted the most aren't perfect, it's like the rug gets pulled out from under you. You're left scrambling, trying to find your balance in a world that suddenly feels unsteady. But here's the thing. The grief of letting go of that perfect image is necessary. It's part of the healing process. I had to let go of the illusion of perfection in order to see my family for what they really were. Human. And once I accepted that, it was like I could finally breathe again. I could stop holding on to this fantasy of a perfect family and start building something real. Something based on the truth, no matter how painful it was. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about accepting it and moving forward. This process wasn't easy, though. There were days when I felt angry, betrayed, and completely lost. There were nights when I lay awake, wondering if I would ever be able to look at my parents the same way again. And honestly, there were times when I felt like I had lost my connection with them entirely. How do you rebuild that trust after everything has been shattered? How do you come to terms with the fact that the family you thought you had is not the family you knew at all? But over time I realized that the grieving process wasn't about holding on to what was lost. It was about making peace with it. It was about acknowledging that my family was flawed, but still capable of love. It was about understanding that no one is perfect, that everyone makes mistakes. I couldn't hold on to that perfect image of them anymore. Instead, I had to see them as they were. Two people who had hurt each other, yes, but also two people who had the potential to heal. And that was the hardest truth of all to come to terms with. Letting go of the perfect family image didn't mean I loved them any less. In fact, it made me love them more. I had to love them as they were, not as I wished them to be. And that's when the real healing began. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about learning how to move forward, with all of its imperfections, its flaws, and its challenges. And the thing is, this process of grieving and letting go didn't stop with my parents. It was about me too. Letting go of that perfect image of myself, of the person I thought I was, based on the family I thought I had, was just as important. I couldn't continue to live in that bubble. I had to accept my own imperfections, my own mistakes, and find my own path forward. The grief, the loss, the pain, it all became part of my personal discovery. And as I moved through the grieving process, I started to realize something important. Sometimes the pain is a necessary part of growth. Letting go of the idealized family, the perfect image of myself, was the first step toward rebuilding something real, something authentic. But even as I started to accept the truth and grieve the loss of that perfect family image, I knew there was still more work to do. The real healing would come when I learned to rebuild myself, my self-identity, after everything had changed. And that journey was just beginning. Next, I'll explore how I began to rebuild my sense of self after everything had fallen apart, and how I started to find my own identity in the midst of this emotional chaos. When everything about your life, your family, your past, and your identity gets thrown into chaos, the question becomes, who are you really? For so long, my sense of self had been rooted in my family. The love they gave me, the trust we shared, the image of who I was in their eyes. But when all of that came crashing down, I found myself questioning everything I thought I knew about myself. If my family wasn't who I thought they were, if my entire understanding of trust, love, and relationships had been upended, then who was I now? The emotional journey I was on was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just about dealing with the affair anymore. It was about understanding who I was in the aftermath of everything. My entire self-identity had been shaped by a lie. A family secret that I hadn't even known existed. How could I trust myself when I had been so blind to the truth? How could I even look at myself in the mirror knowing that my very existence had been built on a foundation of deception and betrayal? In the beginning, I felt completely lost. I didn't know how to move forward, how to rebuild, or how to figure out who I was without the idealized family I had once known. I spent days, weeks, even months trying to figure it all out. There were moments when I felt like I was drowning in my own confusion, unsure of where to go or what to do. It was as if the person I had been, the person I thought I was, had disappeared, and I was left standing in the wreckage of my own life. But as time passed, I began to understand something important. Rebuilding yourself after a betrayal, after a painful revelation like this, doesn't happen overnight. It's not something you can force or rush. It's a gradual process, one that requires self-compassion, patience, and, above all, the willingness to accept yourself as you are. Flaws, scars, and all. The first step for me was giving myself permission to grieve. Not just the loss of my idealized family, but the loss of that version of myself that I had believed in. I had to allow myself to feel the anger, the sadness, the confusion without judgment. For so long I had been so focused on trying to hold everything together, trying to fix what was broken in my family, that I had neglected my own feelings. It was time to take a step back and process the pain, without pushing it aside or pretending like it wasn't there. Next, I had to take responsibility for my own healing. I couldn't rely on my family or anyone else to fix me. I had to find my own path forward. That meant seeking therapy, reading books on self-discovery, and surrounding myself with people who encouraged me to grow. It was a slow and sometimes painful process, but every step I took, no matter how small, helped me rebuild my sense of self. Therapy helped me understand that my value wasn't tied to my family's actions or mistakes. I had to learn to separate my self-worth from the things I couldn't control, like my parents' choices or the past that I couldn't change. I also had to work on my trust issues. It was incredibly difficult to rebuild trust after everything I had learned, but I knew that if I didn't learn how to trust again, both others and myself, I would remain stuck in a cycle of pain and fear. And that was something I wasn't willing to do. Trust didn't come easily, though. It was like learning to walk again after breaking a leg. Each step was tentative, unsure, but still a step forward. I began to put myself in situations where I could test my trust, even in small ways. I reached out to friends, opened up about my struggles, and allowed myself to be vulnerable. I didn't expect anyone to have all the answers or to fix my pain. But little by little, I began to see that trust wasn't about expecting perfection from others. It was about being willing to be open, despite the fear of being hurt again. And as I learned to trust myself again, I slowly rebuilt the confidence I had lost. I stopped blaming myself for things that were out of my control. I started recognizing my own worth, outside of the family drama and betrayal that had once defined me. But rebuilding my identity also meant redefining my relationships. I couldn't just go back to the way things were with my family. That was impossible. I had to set new boundaries, rebuild trust in a way that felt authentic and healthy for me. I had to learn how to love them, not in spite of their flaws, but because of them. I realized that my parents weren't perfect, they were human just like me. And while they had made mistakes, they were also capable of growth and change, just as I was. Over time, I started to see myself differently. I wasn't just a victim of betrayal or the product of a family secret. I was someone who had faced a painful truth and come out stronger on the other side. My identity wasn't just tied to my family's narrative, it was tied to my own story, the one I was writing every day with every choice I made. I was no longer defined by the affair or the family drama. I was learning to define myself by my own values, my own strength, and my own ability to move forward despite the pain. That's when I started to feel like I was truly healing. Rebuilding myself wasn't just about finding who I was in relation to my family. It was about finding who I was without them. I didn't need their approval or validation anymore. I was enough just as I was. And as I began to embrace that truth, I started to reclaim my life. But, as I came to realize, this journey of self-discovery wasn't something I could ever finish. It's an ongoing process, something I would need to continue working on for the rest of my life. There will always be moments when the pain resurfaces, when the scars feel fresh again. But now I know how to handle them. I know how to face the pain and continue moving forward no matter what. As much as I had to rebuild my trust, my self-worth, and my identity, I also had to embrace the fact that the journey was far from over. There would be more challenges ahead, more obstacles to overcome, and more healing to do. But at least I was on the path now, a path that was mine to walk with my own strength, my own resilience, and my own sense of self. In the next chapter, I'll talk about the other person involved in the affair, how I dealt with their role in my life, and whether I ever found any closure with them. But for now, the most important thing was that I had begun the process of rebuilding myself, brick by brick. And that was something I could be proud of. Next, I'll share how I sought answers from the other person involved, and whether I ever achieved closure in this painful chapter of my life. For a long time, I avoided thinking about the other person involved in the affair. To be honest, I didn't even want to know much about them. The thought of facing them or understanding their side of the story made me feel sick to my stomach. After all, this person was partly responsible for shattering my entire sense of self, my family, and everything I had once believed about love and trust. But at some point, as much as I tried to push it away, I realized that I couldn't move forward without confronting this aspect of the affair. I needed answers. I needed to understand the other person's role in all of this. I won't lie, it was terrifying. The idea of reaching out to someone who had caused me so much pain, someone who had been a part of the deception that turned my life upside down, felt like opening a door to a whole new world of hurt. But deep down, I knew that confronting the truth wasn't just about confronting my family. It was about confronting all the pieces of the puzzle, including the one person who had played a major part in the affair. I started by asking my mom more about this person. Who they were, how they had come into her life, and how the affair had evolved. I didn't expect any new revelations. At this point, I already knew the basics. The affair had started years ago, during a rough patch in their marriage, and had lasted longer than I had imagined. But what I hadn't expected to hear was how my mom described this other person. She wasn't defensive or apologetic. Instead, she spoke about them with a surprising level of honesty. She told me that the relationship wasn't something she had planned or intended to happen, but something that had grown over time. She described the other person as someone who had made her feel understood when my dad wasn't there for her. They had provided the emotional connection that she was missing, even though she knew deep down it wasn't the right thing to do. What struck me the most was the level of guilt my mom carried for this. She wasn't just guilty about the affair itself. She was guilty about the emotional betrayal. She had allowed herself to get attached to someone else, to invest in a relationship outside of her marriage. And she knew that, despite everything, I had been affected by it. It wasn't just about her and my dad anymore. It was about me too. That realization hit me hard. This affair wasn't just a personal betrayal between my parents. It was something that had reverberated through my entire life, and I would never truly escape its consequences. But then there was the next step. How would I deal with the person who had been a part of this affair? Would I ever get the chance to speak with them? Did I even want to? The answer, of course, was complicated. Part of me wanted closure. I wanted to know who this person was, why they'd gotten involved, and if they ever truly understood the impact of what they had done. The other part of me, though, wanted nothing more than to forget they existed entirely. I didn't want them to be a part of my story anymore. Eventually, I decided to reach out. I don't know exactly what I was expecting from this interaction, but I knew it had to happen if I was ever going to fully close this chapter of my life. I found their contact information, hesitated for what felt like hours, and finally sent a message. It was brief, to the point, and surprisingly civil. I know about the affair. I need to understand your role in this. Can we talk? Surprisingly, they responded. I didn't know what to expect when they agreed to meet. Was this person going to be defensive, apologetic, or completely indifferent? I honestly didn't know if I was ready for any of it. But I went. The meeting was awkward, to say the least. Sitting across from someone who had caused me so much pain was strange. They weren't the villain I had imagined them to be, nor were they a knight in shining armor either. They were simply human. As they spoke, I could see the regret in their eyes. They apologized for what they had done, though their apology felt somewhat detached. It wasn't the heartfelt, emotional confession I had hoped for. It wasn't the moment of clarity that would make everything better. But it was something. It was an acknowledgement that they knew their actions had consequences. Not just for my parents, but for me too. They explained that they hadn't intended for the affair to last, but that they, too, had gotten caught up in emotions, in a relationship that had been easy to escape to when things got difficult at home. What surprised me most, though, was how little they seemed to truly understand the impact of their actions. They spoke about the affair as if it were just another chapter in their life, something that had happened and was now over. I don't think they fully grasped how deeply it had affected me, how the betrayal of my parents had also been a betrayal of me. For them, it was a past mistake. For me, it was a wound that had yet to heal. And in that moment, I realized something important. Closure doesn't always come from the person who wronged you. Sometimes it comes from within yourself. You have to accept the truth, no matter how unsatisfying or incomplete it may be. You have to take back control of your story, even when the other person doesn't fully grasp the depth of their role in it. By the end of the meeting, I still felt unsettled. I still had questions, and I still didn't fully understand why things had happened the way they did. But what I did understand was this. The closure I was looking for wasn't something that was going to be handed to me. It was something I had to find on my own. I had to accept the fact that the other person involved in the affair wasn't going to provide all the answers. They weren't going to make everything okay. The healing had to come from within me. As difficult as it was, I was able to let go of the need for their approval or their apology. I realized that forgiveness wasn't about them. It was about me. It was about freeing myself from the anger and resentment that had been holding me back for so long. And that's when I began to truly heal, when I stopped waiting for others to fix my pain, and started taking ownership of my own journey. The next step was forgiving not just them but myself. And that was the most powerful thing I could do to continue moving forward. Next, I'll talk about forgiveness, whether it was possible, how I navigated it, and how it allowed me to move on in my healing process. Forgiveness is one of those concepts that sounds simple, almost like a nice idea. But when you're faced with the kind of betrayal I went through, the affair, the lies, the emotional shock, suddenly the idea of forgiveness doesn't seem so easy. In fact, it feels impossible. I remember thinking, how could I ever forgive my parents for what they did? How could I forgive the other person involved? How could I let go of the hurt, the anger, the sense of betrayal that had become so much a part of me? These questions consumed me, making it harder to even consider forgiveness as a viable option. For the longest time, I held on to the belief that forgiveness meant letting them off the hook, that it meant excusing their actions or forgetting what they did. I couldn't wrap my head around it. I thought to myself, if I forgive them, am I saying it's okay? Am I saying that the affair, the emotional turmoil, the years of hidden truth were somehow acceptable? Didn't feel right. The hurt I felt was too fresh, too raw. It felt like forgiving would mean allowing it all to happen again, like I was giving up my right to feel angry or betrayed. But over time, I began to realize something. Forgiveness isn't about the other person. It's about you. It's not about making excuses for their actions or pretending like everything's fine. Forgiveness is about freeing yourself from the emotional weight that the betrayal has put on you. It's about letting go of the anger and the resentment that have been holding you back so that you can heal. It's a gift you give yourself, not them. Letting go of that anger was incredibly difficult. It wasn't like I could just wake up one day and say, I forgive them. That's not how it works. Forgiveness is a process. It's not linear, and it's certainly not easy. There were days when I thought I had forgiven them, only to find myself angry all over again. There were days when I couldn't even look at my parents without feeling the weight of everything they had done. But with time, I began to realize that holding on to that anger wasn't helping me. It was hurting me. It was keeping me stuck in the past, keeping me tethered to the pain. The hardest part of forgiving my parents was coming to terms with the fact that they weren't perfect. They weren't the flawless figures I had once thought them to be. They had made mistakes, big ones, and while that didn't make what they did okay, it did make them human. They were flawed just like everyone else. The difference between my parents and other people was that their flaws were exposed, their mistakes laid bare for me to see. And as much as that hurt, it also helped me understand that forgiveness wasn't about excusing their mistakes. It was about understanding them, accepting that they had made a grave error, and then deciding whether or not I wanted to carry the weight of that mistake for the rest of my life. The truth was, holding on to that anger wasn't just hurting my parents, it was hurting me. It was preventing me from moving forward, from healing, and from rebuilding my life. I realized that I didn't want to stay stuck in that place of hurt and resentment. I wanted to move on. I wanted to heal. And that meant letting go of the anger, the pain, and yes, even the bitterness. But forgiving didn't mean forgetting. That's the important distinction. It didn't mean pretending like nothing had happened. It didn't mean that everything was magically okay. It meant accepting that the affair had happened, that the betrayal was real, and that I had every right to feel hurt. But it also meant understanding that I couldn't keep carrying that weight around forever. It was too heavy, and it was preventing me from living the life I deserved to live. The journey to forgiveness wasn't smooth. There were setbacks, moments when the pain resurfaced, and moments when I questioned whether I was ready to forgive. But with time, I came to realize that moving on wasn't just about forgiving my parents or the other person. It was about forgiving myself. I had to stop blaming myself for what happened. I had to let go of the guilt I carried, the feeling that somehow I was responsible for the affair, for the broken trust, for everything that had fallen apart. It wasn't my fault. I wasn't to blame. And until I forgave myself, I couldn't truly move forward. As I navigated this process, I realized that forgiveness was more than just a decision. It was a commitment. It was a commitment to myself, to my own healing, to my own peace. It was about choosing to stop letting the past dictate my future, about choosing to stop letting the hurt and betrayal control my life. And as hard as it was, I knew it was the right choice. Forgiveness didn't happen overnight. It wasn't easy and it wasn't perfect, but it was necessary. And eventually I found a way to move on, not in spite of what had happened, but because of it. I found the strength to rebuild my life, to rebuild my self-worth, and to reclaim my peace. So, was forgiveness possible? Was it easy? Absolutely not. But it was worth it. It wasn't about excusing their actions or pretending like everything was okay. It was about letting go of the pain, the anger, and the resentment. It was about finding peace, even in the midst of the chaos. In the end, forgiveness wasn't just a decision. It was a process of reclaiming my power, of choosing to move on, and of deciding that I was worth more than the hurt I had experienced. And once I made that choice, I started to feel lighter, freer, and more at peace with myself. But that didn't mean my healing was over. In fact, the process of healing was just beginning. Next, I'll dive into the emotional aftermath of everything, the lasting effects this journey has had on my mental health, my relationships, and my overall outlook on life. The journey I went through, from the discovery of the affair to the process of forgiveness, didn't just change my relationships. It changed me fundamentally and profoundly. Looking back, I can see how much of my emotional landscape was altered by this experience. The pain, the betrayal, the confusion, they all left marks on my soul, but they also taught me lessons I couldn't have learned any other way. As much as I hated the emotional turmoil that came with discovering the truth, I had to admit that it reshaped me in ways I never expected. In the beginning, I was a mess. I couldn't think straight, I couldn't sleep, and every day felt like a struggle to just get through. The emotional weight of the affair wasn't something you could simply brush off. It wasn't like I could wake up one day and pretend like everything was fine. The emotional shock of discovering that my family had been hiding something so monumental from me felt like being sucker-punched. I couldn't escape the pain. It was there in every waking moment. Even the simplest things like going to a family dinner or talking to my mom felt tainted by the knowledge of the affair. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had been built on lies. It was like living in a house that had been carefully constructed, only to find out it was built on sand. The hardest part was the guilt. I blamed myself for everything. I thought maybe if I had been more perceptive, if I had asked more questions, maybe I could have uncovered the truth sooner. But as time passed, I realized that the affair wasn't my fault. It wasn't something I had caused or could have prevented. But that didn't make the emotional toll any easier to bear. The aftermath of betrayal isn't just about the relationship with the person who betrayed you. It's about how you view yourself afterward. My self-worth took a major hit. I questioned everything I knew about love, trust, and even my own identity. If my parents, the people who I had trusted more than anyone, could betray me like this, how could I trust anyone again? How could I trust myself to make the right decisions, to trust the people I loved, to know what was real? But slowly I started to rebuild. It wasn't quick, and it wasn't without setbacks. The emotional aftermath of the affair lingered long after the truth came out. I'd have good days, days when I felt like I was making progress, and then I'd have bad days, days when the hurt resurfaced and I felt like I was back at square one. But with time, I started to realize that this emotional journey wasn't linear. It wasn't something I could just check off a list and move on from. It was a process that I would have to go through at my own pace, in my own way. The important thing was that I didn't let the emotional scars define me. I refused to let the pain of betrayal become the only thing I saw when I looked at myself. I also began to understand the long-term effects the affair had on my relationships. Trust issues became a huge part of my emotional landscape. I found myself second-guessing everything, from casual friendships to romantic relationships. I was hyper-aware of every little sign that someone might be hiding something from me, and it made it hard to form deep connections with others. I wasn't just questioning my parents anymore. I was questioning everyone. It was a toxic cycle that I had to break if I was ever going to move forward. It wasn't easy, but I started small. I began by trusting again in little ways. I took baby steps in rebuilding my trust with the people around me, starting with the friends who had stood by me during the hardest times. I allowed myself to be vulnerable again, to open up to people I had once shut out. And as I did, I realized that not everyone would betray me. Not everyone was hiding a secret. It was a slow and sometimes painful process, but with time I learned to trust again, not just in others but in myself. The affair had a lasting effect on my mental health as well. There were times when I felt overwhelmed by anxiety, when the weight of everything became too much to bear. The emotional trauma left scars that weren't visible to anyone else, and it took a toll on my ability to cope with the stresses of everyday life. I found myself withdrawing, isolating from others, and struggling to stay focused. But as I worked through my emotions and began to rebuild my self-worth, I started to find healthier ways of managing my mental health. Therapy became a vital part of my healing process, helping me untangle the web of emotions I was feeling. Exercise, meditation, and journaling became tools I used to help myself heal. These small actions didn't fix everything overnight, but they gave me the strength I needed to keep moving forward. The emotional aftermath of the affair didn't just affect my relationships with others. It also reshaped my outlook on life. I became more aware of the fragility of trust, of how easily it can be broken and how long it takes to rebuild. I also became more attuned to my own needs, learning to listen to myself, to honor my emotions, and to set boundaries when needed. The experience taught me that healing is a journey, not a destination. It's something you have to work at every day, and it doesn't always look the way you expect it to. But despite everything, I found strength in the journey. The affair, as painful as it was, gave me the opportunity to rebuild myself, to redefine my values, and to learn how to trust again, both in others and in myself. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. And now, when I look back on everything I've been through, I see it as a part of who I am, not something that defines me or holds me back. I've learned that no matter how deep the pain, no matter how strong the betrayal, there is always a way forward. There is always hope for healing, for growth, and for a future that is better than the past. Next, I'll explore the lessons I've learned throughout this journey, how the pain has helped me grow stronger, and the advice I would give to others who may be going through something similar. When I reflect on everything I've been through, the affair, the betrayal, the emotional aftermath, it's easy to focus on the pain. It's easy to get stuck in the why me mentality, to feel like I've been dealt a hand that's unfair, that no one should ever have to go through. But the truth is, as much as the pain hurt, it also taught me lessons that I could never have learned any other way. Pain has a way of pushing you to grow, to confront things about yourself and the world around you that you would rather avoid. And although I never would have chosen this path, I can't deny that it made me stronger. The most important lesson I've learned is that healing doesn't happen on your terms. It's not something you can control, and it's certainly not something you can rush. I spent so much time in the beginning trying to force myself to move on, to get over it. But the truth is, healing takes time. It's a process that unfolds at its own pace, and you can't control it. I had to let go of my need to have everything figured out. I had to stop expecting that one day I would just wake up and feel better. The pain I felt, whether it was from the affair or from the emotional scars left behind, wasn't something I could just wish away. But as I stopped resisting it, as I allowed myself to truly feel everything I was going through, I began to heal. Slowly, surely, but with each day the pain became more manageable. And eventually, I found that the most painful parts of the journey became the most transformative. Another lesson I learned was the importance of setting boundaries. For so long I had allowed my family, especially my parents, to dictate my sense of security. I had always assumed that because they were family, because they loved me, I should always be there for them no matter what. But the truth is, love doesn't mean accepting toxic behavior or accepting betrayal. Love doesn't mean staying silent when something hurts. Setting boundaries became one of the most powerful tools I had in reclaiming my life. I learned to say no when I needed to protect myself from situations that didn't serve me, and to make choices based on what was best for my mental and emotional well-being. It wasn't easy. It wasn't something I could do overnight. But by learning to set boundaries, I was able to take control of my life in a way I had never done before. I realized that I didn't have to sacrifice my happiness for the sake of others. And while I still love my family, I've learned that love isn't about sacrificing yourself. It's about mutual respect, understanding, and growth. Trust is another lesson that the affair taught me, and it's one that I still grapple with. Before all of this, I trusted people easily. I trusted my family. I trusted my friends. But after the affair, trust became something that I had to rebuild, not just with others but with myself. I had to learn to trust my own instincts, to trust my ability to make good decisions, and to trust that I was worthy of healthy, honest relationships. And that took time. I had to learn that not everyone who comes into your life will betray you, but I also had to acknowledge that sometimes people make mistakes, sometimes even the ones you love most. But that doesn't mean I should close myself off to the world. It just means I have to be more discerning, more cautious, and more aware of the red flags that exist. The biggest lesson, though, was learning to trust myself again. For so long, I had doubted my own judgment. How could I have been so blind to the affair? How could I have missed the signs? But in the end, I realized that I wasn't to blame for what happened. I wasn't the one who chose to betray the trust of my family. It wasn't my fault. I had to let go of the guilt and the self-blame. I had to trust that I had done the best I could with the information I had. And as I began to trust myself again, I found that my self-worth, my confidence, and my ability to make decisions all began to return. One thing I would want anyone who's been through something like this to know is that pain doesn't define you. It shapes you, yes, but it doesn't have to determine who you become. I spent a lot of time thinking that the affair, the betrayal, the family drama, that's who I was now. I thought it would be the thing people remembered me for. But eventually, I realized that my story wasn't defined by what happened to me. It was defined by how I chose to respond to it. I could either let the pain of the affair consume me, or I could use it as a stepping stone for growth, for transformation. And while it hasn't been easy, I've chosen the latter. I've chosen to grow, to heal, and to move forward with a stronger sense of self. If you're dealing with something similar, I want to tell you, don't let the pain be the end of your story. It might feel like it's all-encompassing, like it's going to crush you under its weight, but it won't. You'll come out on the other side of it. You will heal and you will grow. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to grieve. But remember that the pain doesn't define who you are. It's what you do with it that matters. Use it as fuel to build a better, stronger version of yourself. Learn from it. Grow from it. And most importantly, never let anyone else's actions dictate your worth. I'm not perfect and I don't have all the answers. But the one thing I do know for sure is that the lessons I've learned through this experience have made me a stronger, more resilient person. I've learned that healing is not about erasing the past. It's about learning to live with it, to accept it, and to use it to build a better future. Next, I'll wrap up my journey with a conclusion about moving forward, embracing the lessons I've learned, and sharing my hopes for the future. Looking back on everything I've gone through, the affair, the emotional turmoil, the journey of healing, it's hard to believe how far I've come. At one point, I couldn't imagine getting through the pain. I couldn't see beyond the betrayal, the confusion, the anger. But now I can see how each step of this journey has shaped me into the person I am today. And while I'll never forget what happened, I've learned that moving on doesn't mean erasing the past. It means learning to live with it, embracing the lessons it has taught me, and using those lessons to build a better future. I've come to realize that healing is not a destination. It's a lifelong process. There will always be moments when the pain resurfaces, when the memories of the affair and the betrayal creep back into my mind. But now I know how to handle it. I've learned to embrace the discomfort, to sit with the feelings, and to keep moving forward even when it feels hard. Healing doesn't mean you won't hurt anymore. It means that the pain doesn't control you. It means that you can find peace in the midst of the chaos, and that you can rebuild your life, no matter how broken it seems. One of the biggest lessons I've learned is that you don't have to be perfect to move forward. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't even have to know exactly what the future holds. What matters is that you keep going. You keep showing up for yourself, even when it feels like everything is falling apart. I've learned to trust myself again, to trust that I have the strength to face whatever comes my way. And that's something no one can take from me. As I continue this journey, I'm focusing on building the life I want for myself. I'm creating a future that is shaped by the lessons I've learned, by the person I've become. I'm choosing to move forward with an open heart, with the understanding that relationships take work, trust takes time, and healing takes patience. I don't have all the answers, but I know that the future is mine to create, and I'm determined to make it a future where I am in control of my own happiness. And to anyone reading or listening to this, going through something similar, I want you to know, you are not alone. You don't have to go through this by yourself. It's okay to grieve, it's okay to feel hurt, but it's also okay to heal. You can rebuild your life. You can move on. And you will. You don't have to forget the past, but you don't have to let it define you either. The power to create the future you want is in your hands. So, while I may never forget the lessons that this experience has taught me, I'm ready to move on. I'm ready to embrace the future, to live fully, and to keep growing. I'm no longer defined by the affair, the betrayal, or the broken trust. I'm defined by my ability to heal, to forgive, and to move forward. And that's the person I choose to be. This chapter of my life has ended, but the next one is just beginning. And whatever comes next, I'm ready. Now that you've heard my story, I want to leave you with something important. No matter how much pain you go through, no matter how deep the betrayal cuts, you always have the power to heal and rebuild. It's not easy. It's not quick. But it's possible. If you're dealing with something similar, whether it's family secrets, betrayal, or the struggle to find your own identity, just know that you're not alone. You have the strength to move forward, to reclaim your life, and to find peace. Forgiveness, trust, and healing are all choices we can make, even when it feels impossible. So take it one day at a time. Give yourself grace. And remember, it's okay to not have all the answers right away. Healing is a journey, not a destination. But with every step you take, you're moving closer to the life you deserve. If my story helped you in any way, please leave a comment below. Share your thoughts, your experiences, and let's continue this conversation. And if you want to keep learning about how to heal, grow, and rebuild your life after betrayal, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on the next video. You've got this. Believe in you.